The entire ballroom of the Grand Oak Hotel fell silent. 300 of the city's elite turned their eyes toward the head table. Mark Sterling, a man who prided himself on his image, stood with a microphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other, a cruel smirk plastered on his face. Beside him sat his wife, Elena, her head bowed, her face burning with shame as laughter rippled through the crowd. "Let's be honest," Mark's voice boomed over the speakers. "Elena didn't marry me for my looks, and looking at her dress tonight, I certainly didn't marry her for her fashion sense. I married her because she had nowhere else to go." The crowd roared with laughter. Mark felt invincible. He thought he was the king of the world, mocking the woman who had stood by him for 5 years. But he didn't check the guest list. He didn't know that the helicopter landing on the roof at that very moment carried a man who could buy and sell Mark Sterling 10 times over. The king was about to meet the emperor, and Elena was about to stop bowing her head. The morning of their 5th anniversary did not begin with flowers. It did not begin with breakfast in bed or a soft kiss or even a simple happy anniversary. It began with a criticism. "Elena?" Mark's voice echoed from the master bedroom, sharp and impatient. "Where is my navy tie, the silk one, not the cheap polyester trash you bought me last Christmas?" Elena sighed, placing her coffee cup down on the granite counter of the kitchen island. She wiped her hands on her apron, an old faded thing that had seen better days, and hurried up the winding staircase. The house was a sprawling mansion in the hills of Seattle, a testament to Mark's rising success as the regional VP of Chimera Tech. It was cold, modern, and devoid of warmth, much like their marriage. When she entered the bedroom, Mark Sterling was standing in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting his cufflinks. He was a handsome man, objectively. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a jawline that looked carved from granite, but his eyes were cold, always calculating. "It's on the rack, Mark," Elena said softly, walking over to the closet. "Right where I put it yesterday after the dry cleaners." She pulled the tie out and held it up. Mark snatched it from her hand without looking at her. "You look tired," he said, tying the knot with practiced precision. He didn't say it with concern. He said it like an accusation. "You know tonight is important. The board of directors will be there. Mayor Henderson is coming. I can't have you looking like this." He gestured vaguely at her. Elena looked down at herself. She was wearing comfortable leggings and an oversized sweater. She had spent the last 3 hours cleaning the house because Mark refused to hire a maid, claiming he didn't trust strangers with his valuables. "I have an appointment at the salon at 2, Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll look presentable, Mark. I promise." Mark turned to her, finally, his eyes scanning her face with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Presentable. That's the ceiling for you, isn't it, Elena? Just try not to embarrass me. Jessica is coming tonight, and you know how impeccable she always looks." The name stung. Jessica Thorne. Mark's business associate. A woman who wore Prada-like armor and looked at Elena as if she were a stain on the carpet. "I didn't know Jessica was invited to our anniversary dinner," Elena said, a lump forming in her throat. Mark laughed a short, dismissive sound. "It's not just an anniversary dinner, Elena. Grow up. It's a networking event. My anniversary is just the excuse to get the investors in one room. Don't make this about your sentimental fantasies." He grabbed his briefcase and brushed past her, checking his reflection one last time. "Here," he said, pulling a few $100 bills from his wallet and tossing them onto the unmade bed. "Buy yourself some new shoes. The ones you wore last year look like something a librarian would wear to a funeral." Elena watched the bills flutter onto the duvet. "Mark, the dinner is black tie. A decent pair of heels costs—" "Make it work," he interrupted, walking out the door. "You're good at being thrifty, aren't you? It's how you grew up. Stick to what you know." The door slammed shut downstairs. Elena stood alone in the massive, silent bedroom. She walked over to the window and watched Mark's Porsche speed out of the driveway. She picked up the money. $300. For shoes, makeup, and accessories for the biggest gala of the year. It was an impossible task, and he knew it. He wanted her to fail. He wanted her to look cheap so he could shine brighter by comparison. Elena walked to her closet and pushed aside the modest clothes Mark allowed her to wear. She reached into the very back behind a loose panel in the wall that she had discovered years ago. She pulled out a small velvet box and a burner phone. She opened the phone. There was only one number saved in it. She stared at it for a long time. "Not yet," she whispered to herself. "I promised Dad I'd give it 5 years. I have to know if he loves me or if he just loves the control." But as she looked at the crumpled bills on the bed, she realized she already knew the answer. By 1:00 p.m., the house was spotless. Elena had scrubbed the floors until her knees ached. She was just about to head upstairs to shower and prepare for her budget makeover when the doorbell rang. She froze. Mark had a key. Who would be visiting? She opened the heavy oak door to reveal a woman in a white fur coat despite the mild autumn weather. Her hair was a helmet of stiff blonde curls, and her face was pulled tight by one too many surgeries. Victoria Sterling, Mark's mother. "Well," Victoria said, breezing past Elena without waiting for an invitation. "Don't you look domestic?" "Hello, Victoria," Elena said, closing the door. "I wasn't expecting you until the dinner tonight." Victoria walked into the living room, running a gloved finger over the mantelpiece, checking for dust. Finding none, she looked almost disappointed. She turned to Elena, her eyes narrowing. "Mark called me," Victoria said, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "He was worried, the poor boy. He said you were seemingly overwhelmed with the preparations, and he was afraid you might underdeliver." "I have everything under control," Elena said firmly. "Do you?" Victoria laughed. She reached into her oversized designer bag and pulled out a garment bag. "I brought you something. An old dress of mine from the 90s. It's a bit dated, but I thought it might fit your figure better than whatever rag you were planning to buy at the clearance rack." She tossed the bag onto the sofa. It was an insult wrapped in charity. "That's very generous, Victoria, but I already have a dress." Elena lied. She didn't. She was planning to wear the only formal gown she owned, a simple black dress she had bought 4 years ago. Victoria stepped closer, invading Elena's personal space. The smell of expensive, overpowering perfume filled the air. "Listen to me, you little mouse. Tonight is Mark's night. He is on the verge of a promotion that will change this family's destiny. Do not, and I repeat, do not open your mouth unless someone asks you a direct question. You have a habit of boring people with your little stories about, what was it, teaching art to orphans." "I was a volunteer art teacher for underprivileged children," Elena corrected her, her jaw tightening. "Exactly." Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "Depressing. Nobody wants to hear about poverty while they're eating caviar. Just smile, nod, and look at Mark with adoration. That is your job. It's the least you can do considering he pulled you out of that studio apartment and gave you this life." Elena felt a spark of anger deep in her chest. This life. A life of servitude, loneliness, and constant emotional battering. "I didn't marry Mark for his money," Elena said quietly. Victoria scoffed. "Oh, please. Everyone marries for something. Mark married you because you were pretty in a helpless sort of way, and you were easy to mold. Don't pretend you didn't marry him for security. What were you? A nobody. No family, no connections, just a dead father and a mountain of student debt." Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides. "Don't speak about my father." Victoria's eyes flashed cold. "I'll speak however I want in my son's house. Now go get ready. And use plenty of concealer. You look like a ghost." Victoria sat down on the sofa, pulling out her phone, effectively dismissing Elena. Elena walked up the stairs, her heart pounding against her ribs. She went into the bathroom and turned on the shower, letting the steam fill the room. She looked at herself in the mirror. Victoria was right about one thing. She looked like a ghost. The vibrant, passionate art student she had been 5 years ago was gone. Mark had chipped away at her piece by piece until only this shell remained. She thought about the burner phone again. 5 years, her father had said in his will. Live as a commoner for 5 years. Find a man who loves Elena, not the heiress. If you find him, you keep your freedom. If you don't, you take your place at the head of the table. Tonight was exactly 5 years to the day. Elena turned off the water. She didn't cry. She was done crying. She reached for her makeup kit. She didn't use the money Mark gave her. Instead, she reached into her jewelry box and pulled out a pair of earrings. They looked like simple glass costume jewelry to the untrained eye. Mark had told her to throw them away years ago. But they weren't glass. They were flawless 4-carat diamonds cut by the finest jeweler in Vienna. A gift from her uncle Silas for her 18th birthday. She put them on. They caught the light sparkling with a fire that matched the new look in her eyes. "Game on, Mark," she whispered. The ride to the Grand Oak Hotel was silent. Mark drove the Porsche aggressively, weaving through traffic while Elena stared out the window. She was wearing the simple black dress, but she had altered the neckline herself an hour ago, plunging it slightly deeper, making it look more elegant, more daring. With the diamond earrings and her hair swept up in a severe chic chignon, she looked regal. But Mark hadn't even looked at her. He was too busy on a Bluetooth call with Jessica. "Yes, I secured the private booth for the after-party," Mark was saying, laughing charmlessly. "Don't worry, Jess. The contract is as good as signed. Once the CEO retires next month, that VP spot is mine. I'll be running the entire West Coast division." He paused, listening to something Jessica said on the other end. "Her..." Mark glanced sideways at Elena, his lip curling. "She's here. Don't worry, I told her the rules. She won't get in the way." Elena stared straight ahead, her face a mask of calm. Inside, a bridge was burning. They arrived at the hotel. Valets in red vests rushed to open the doors. Camera flashes popped as they stepped onto the red carpet. This was a high-profile event, the Sterling Anniversary Gala, funded by the company as a PR stunt. "Smile," Mark hissed through his teeth, grabbing Elena's arm. His grip was tight, bordering on painful. "And stand up straight." Elena smiled. But it wasn't the submissive smile he was used to. It was a cold, sharp smile. She pulled her arm from his grip gently but firmly and walked beside him, not behind him. They entered the ballroom. It was a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the ceiling. A string quartet played Mozart in the corner. "Mark," a booming voice called out. It was Gary Reynolds, one of Mark's sycophantic colleagues. He walked over, a champagne flute in hand, eyeing Elena up and down. "Happy anniversary, you two." 5 years, huh? That's a lifetime in this town," Gary joked. He looked at Elena. "And Elena, you look nice. Very simple. I like a woman who knows her place and doesn't try to outshine her husband." "Thank you, Gary," Elena said, her voice smooth as silk. "I find that simplicity often hides the most value. Unlike some things that are just loud and empty." Gary blinked, confused. Mark stiffened. "She's joking," Mark said quickly, shooting a glare at Elena. "Elena has a weird sense of humor. Go find our table, honey. The adults need to talk business." He dismissed her like a child. In the past, Elena would have apologized and scurried away. "Actually," Elena said, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, "I think I'll stay. I'm quite interested in the West Coast Division's performance this quarter. I hear the Asian market is volatile." Mark stared at her. Gary's jaw dropped slightly. Elena had never spoken about business before. She wasn't supposed to know about the Asian market. "I read the Financial Times," Elena said with a shrug, sipping her drink. "And I noticed that Chimera Tech's stock took a dip yesterday. Rumor is the majority shareholder is unhappy with the current management." Mark's face turned red. "That's enough, Elena. You don't know what you're talking about. Go to the table, now." His voice was low, dangerous, a threat. Elena held his gaze for a second longer than was comfortable. Then she smiled. "As you wish, darling." She turned and walked away. But she didn't go to the table. She walked toward the restroom area, checking her watch. It was 7:55 p.m. She pulled out the burner phone. She typed a single text message. Code Black. I'm done. Come get me. She hit send. As she walked back into the ballroom, she saw Mark sitting at the head table. Next to him was Victoria, and on his other side sat Jessica Thorne. Jessica was wearing a red dress that was cut down to her navel, laughing loudly, her hand resting on Mark's forearm. Elena's seat was at the far end of the table next to a pillar that partially blocked her view. She sat down. She watched them. Mark whispered something in Jessica's ear, and they both looked at Elena and laughed. The waiter poured wine into Elena's glass. "Madam," the waiter asked gently, "are you all right?" Elena looked up. The waiter was a young man looking at her with genuine kindness. "I'm better than all right," Elena said, picking up her fork. "I'm about to enjoy the show." At that moment, the lights in the ballroom dimmed. A spotlight hit the stage. Mark stood up, buttoning his jacket. He looked like a predator sensing a kill. He walked to the microphone for the anniversary toast. Elena took a sip of wine. Here it comes, she thought. The final nail in the coffin. The spotlight burned Mark Sterling, but he basked in it like it was sunlight. He tapped the microphone twice, the sharp thud-thud echoing through the cavernous ballroom. The chatter died down. 300 faces turned toward him. "Thank you all for coming." Mark began, his voice smooth-practiced. 5 years. They say the first 5 years are the hardest. And let me tell you. He paused for effect, chuckling. They aren't wrong. A polite ripple of laughter went through the room. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. She felt Victoria's gaze boring into the side of her head, critical and sharp. "When I met Elena," Mark continued, gesturing vaguely toward the dark corner where his wife sat, "she was working 2 jobs just to pay rent on a closet-sized apartment. She had holes in her shoes." The room went quiet. This was getting too personal, too condescending. "I remember taking her out to her first real dinner," Mark said, grinning. "She didn't even know which fork to use. It was adorable, really, like watching a stray cat try to eat from a crystal bowl." Jessica Thorne, sitting next to Mark, covered her mouth to hide a giggle. The sound was amplified by the microphone Mark was holding too close. "But I'm a charitable man," Mark declared, raising his champagne glass. "I saw a project. I saw someone who needed saving. And for 5 years I provided a roof, clothes, and a life she could never have dreamed of. Sure, she's not the sharpest tool in the shed. She doesn't understand business or politics or how the real world works." Elena's knuckles turned white. He wasn't just insulting her. He was erasing her. He was rewriting history to make himself a savior and her a leech. "So," Mark's voice boomed, the cruelty now fully unmasked, "I want to make a toast, not to love. Let's be realistic. Love doesn't pay the bills, but to patience. My patience. For putting up with a wife who is better suited for a library than a boardroom. To Elena. For trying her best, however mediocre that might be. To Mark," Jessica shouted, raising her glass. "To Mark," Victoria echoed. About half the room raised their glasses, mostly Mark's employees who were too afraid not to. The other half sat in uncomfortable silence. They sensed something was wrong. Mark had gone too far. Mark drank deeply, looking satisfied. He lowered the mic, leaning in to whisper to Jessica. "How has that put her in her place?" "Perfect," Jessica purred. "Now she knows who really owns the throne." Mark turned to look at Elena, expecting to see tears, expecting to see her run out of the room in shame. But Elena wasn't crying. She was checking her watch. 3, 2, 1. She counted softly. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that rattled the hinges. The sound of heavy boots on marble echoed like gunshots. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly. Every head in the room turned. Entering the room were 6 men. They were massive, dressed not in tuxedos but in tactical black suits with earpieces. They moved with the precision of a military unit fanning out to secure the perimeter of the room. "What is this?" Mark shouted into the microphone, his authority wavering. "Security! Get these people out of here. This is a private event." The head of the Grand Oak Hotel's security rushed forward, but one of the men simply held up a hand. The security guard froze, looked at the man's lapel pin, and immediately stepped back, bowing his head in terror. Then he walked in. He was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, but he moved with the vigor of a man half his age. He wore a tuxedo that cost more than Mark's Porsche. He had silver hair swept back, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that were the color of cold steel. He carried a cane topped with a silver wolf's head, but he didn't seem to need it for walking. He used it as a weapon of intimidation. The room gasped. "Is that—" someone whispered near the front. "No, it can't be," another voice hissed. "He doesn't leave Europe. It's Silas Blackwood." A banker at table 4 said, his face draining of color. "The head of the Blackwood Consortium. He owns everything." Mark squinted. He knew the name Blackwood. Everyone in business knew the name. The Blackwood Consortium was a global shadow empire shipping tech, pharmaceuticals, real estate. They ate companies like Chimera Tech for breakfast. But why was Silas Blackwood here? Mark, ever the opportunist, straightened his tie. He assumed this was a surprise visit for business. Maybe Blackwood wanted to acquire Chimera Tech. This was his chance. Mark stepped off the stage and walked down the aisle toward the terrifying figure, hand extended. "Mr. Blackwood," Mark said, putting on his best salesman smile. "What an honor. I'm Mark Sterling, VP of Chimera Tech. I assume you're here to discuss the merger. Please take my seat at the head table." Silas Blackwood didn't break stride. He didn't even look at Mark. He walked straight through him, his shoulder checking Mark so hard that Mark stumbled and nearly fell into a waiter. "Hey," Mark indignantly sputtered. "I am talking to you." Silas stopped. He turned slowly, looking at Mark as if he were a piece of gum stuck to his shoe. "I don't speak to servants," Silas rumbled. His voice was deep, gravelly, and commanded absolute silence. He turned his back on Mark and continued walking. He wasn't walking toward the stage. He wasn't walking toward the mayor or the board of directors. He was walking toward the dark corner near the kitchen, toward the pillar, toward Elena. Mark watched in confusion. "What is he doing?" "That's just my wife." Elena stood up. She smoothed her dress. Silas Blackwood, the man who made prime ministers nervous, stopped in front of Elena. He dropped his cane. It clattered to the floor. He opened his arms. "Little wolf," Silas said, his voice cracking with emotion. "The exile is over." Elena stepped forward and embraced the billionaire. "Hello, Uncle Silas." The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Mark's glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The silence that followed the crashing of the double doors was heavy, physical. It pressed down on the 300 guests in the Grand Oak Ballroom like a sudden change in atmospheric pressure. Mark Sterling stood frozen on the stage, the microphone feedback whining softly in his limp hand. He had been in the middle of a sentence, a final jab at his wife's expense, but the words had died in his throat. At the entrance of the ballroom, the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. It wasn't just an interruption, it was an invasion. 6 men entered first. They were not hotel security. They were not local police. They were Titans men built like linebackers, dressed in bespoke tactical suits that cost more than Mark's entire wardrobe. They moved with a fluid, lethal synchronization, fanning out to secure the perimeter of the room. One of them, a man with a scar running through his eyebrow, locked eyes with the head of the hotel's security team. The hotel guard, a man who usually bullied the waitstaff, audibly swallowed and took a step back, lowering his gaze to the floor. Then the center of the formation parted. He stepped through the gap, and the sound of his cane hitting the marble floor echoed like a judge's gavel. Click, step, click, step. He was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, but age had not softened him. It had only distilled him into something harder, sharper. He wore a tuxedo of midnight blue velvet cut in a style that was both archaic and timeless. His silver hair was swept back from a forehead etched with the lines of 1,000 difficult decisions. But it was his eyes that terrified the room. They were gray, not the soft gray of a cloud, but the hard, merciless gray of a battleship hull. A murmur rippled through the front tables where the city's true power players sat. "My God," whispered the CEO of a rival tech firm, his face draining of color. "That's him." "It can't be," his wife hissed back. "He hasn't left Zurich in a decade." "It's Silas Blackwood," the CEO said, his voice trembling. "The Wolf of Zurich, the chairman of the consortium." The name traveled through the room like a virus. Blackwood. Mark Sterling squinted against the stage lights. He heard the name and his heart gave a strange, hopeful flutter. He knew the Blackwood consortium. Everyone in the tech world knew them. They were the whales of the global market. They owned shipping lines, pharmaceutical giants, and rare earth mines. If Chimera Tech was a speedboat, the Blackwood consortium was the ocean it floated on. Mark's arrogance, bruised but not broken, surged back to the surface. Of course, he thought. This is a surprise inspection, a potential acquisition. They're here for me. He quickly buttoned his jacket, fixed his tie, and plastered on his best sales smile. He forgot about Elena. He forgot about his cruel toast. He saw only opportunity walking toward him. "Mr. Blackwood," Mark's voice boomed over the speakers, regaining its false confidence. "What an incredible surprise. I'm Mark Sterling, the vice president of Chimera Tech. Please come to the head table. We can make room." Mark hopped off the stage, rushing down the aisle to meet the billionaire, his hand extended for a handshake that would seal his destiny. "I assume you're here to discuss the Q3 reports," Mark said, closing the distance. "I was just telling the board that our Asian expansion is ripe for—" Silas Blackwood did not slow down. He did not blink. He walked as if Mark Sterling did not exist. As Mark stepped into his path, one of the bodyguards moved a blur of motion, but Silas held up a single gloved hand. The bodyguard froze. Silas continued walking. Mark stood directly in his way, hand out, smile freezing on his face. "Mr. Blackwood," Mark asked, confusion seeping into his tone. Silas finally looked at him. The gaze was physical. It felt like being scanned by a predator deciding which bone to break first. "Move," Silas rumbled. His voice was deep, a tectonic grind of gravel and authority. Excuse me," Mark stammered. "I'm the host. I'm the VP of—" Silas didn't stop. He simply walked through the space Mark was occupying. He shoulder-checked Mark with a shocking amount of force for a man of his age. Mark spun around, stumbling, his champagne glass flying from his hand and shattering on the floor. "Hey!" Mark shouted, his ego flaring up. "You can't just shove me. I am talking to you. Who do you think you are?" Silas stopped. He turned slowly, pivoting on his silver-headed cane. The entire room held its breath. "I don't speak to servants," Silas said. The words were quiet, but they carried to the back of the room. "Servants!" Mark laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "I make 6 figures. I drive a Porsche. I am not a servant." "You serve your own ego," Silas said, his eyes boring into Mark's soul. "And you serve a master you do not even know you have. But you are right about one thing, Mr. Sterling. You are not a servant. Servants have dignity. You are a parasite." Mark opened his mouth to retort, but Silas had already turned his back. The billionaire continued his march. He wasn't walking toward the mayor. He wasn't walking toward the board of directors. He was walking toward the dark, drafty corner near the kitchen doors. He was walking toward Elena. Mark watched in bewildered horror. "What is he doing? That's just my wife. She's nobody." Elena stood up slowly. The crowd parted for her, people pulling their chairs away as if she were suddenly radiant with radiation. She smoothed the front of her simple black dress. She didn't look down. She looked straight at the terrifying man approaching her. Silas Blackwood stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at her tired face, the lack of makeup, the sadness etched around her mouth. Then his eyes drifted to her ears. He saw the diamond earrings, the only thing of value she had left. The hard lines of his face fractured. The Wolf of Zurich, the man who toppled governments with a phone call, looked like he was about to weep. He let his cane drop. It clattered loudly onto the marble. He didn't care. He opened his arms wide. "Little wolf," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "The exile is over." Elena stepped forward and collapsed into his embrace. She buried her face in his velvet lapel, inhaling the scent of sandalwood and pipe tobacco, the scent of her childhood. "Hello, Uncle Silas," she sobbed. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It sounded like a physical blow. "Uncle!" Victoria Sterling shrieked from the head table, her face pale beneath her layers of foundation. "That's impossible. Her father was a painter, a nobody." Silas pulled back from the hug, keeping one protective arm wrapped firmly around Elena's shoulders. He turned to face the room. The sadness in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a cold Old Testament fury. "Turn on the lights," Silas commanded. He didn't shout, but the order was absolute. A technician scrambled in the booth. The romantic dim mood lighting vanished. Harsh white floodlights bathed the room, exposing every stain, every wrinkle, and every terrified expression. "Mark Sterling," Silas called out. "Step forward." Mark felt his legs moving against his will. He walked toward them, drawn by the gravity of the situation. Jessica Thorne, sensing the shift in the wind, tried to slide out of her chair and sneak toward the exit. "And the mistress," Silas added without looking at her. "You two, sit down or be sat down." A bodyguard blocked Jessica's path. She sat down, trembling. Mark stood 10 feet away, sweating profusely under the bright lights. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Elena, you're a Blackwood." "Elena Blackwood," Silas corrected, his voice booming. "Daughter of Alexander Blackwood, my younger brother, the only heir to the Blackwood estate." "But," Mark pointed a shaking finger at Elena, "she's poor. She has student loans. She coupon clips. She didn't know which fork to use." "She knows which fork to use to eat you alive," Silas said darkly. "She was acting. It was a test, Mark. A test stipulated in her father's will." Silas began to pace, his voice rising, addressing the entire room as a jury. "My brother Alexander hated this world." Silas gestured to the ballroom. "He hated the sycophants, the gold diggers, the people who love money more than blood. When he died, he wanted to ensure his daughter found something he never did: unconditional love. So the terms were set. Elena was to live as a commoner for 5 years. No access to her trust. No using the family name. She had to find a partner who loved her for her, not for the billions she would one day inherit. The word hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating. Billions. Mark felt the blood rushing in his ears. He looked at Elena. He saw the way she stood now, tall, regal, untouchable. He realized that the helplessness he had mocked was a performance he had bought hook, line, and sinker. "You," Mark choked out, "you tested me. And you failed." Elena spoke for the first time. Her voice was steady, clear, and utterly devoid of the fear he was used to. "You failed every single day, Mark. But I stayed. I stayed because I promised my father I would give you the full 5 years. I hoped somewhere deep down you would change. I hoped that under the stress and the ambition there was a good man." She took a step closer to him. "But tonight you showed me that there is nothing under the suit. Just more suit." "But I'm your husband," Mark pleaded, looking around the room for support that wasn't there. "That means, legally, half of what is yours is mine. We have no prenup." Silas threw his head back and laughed. It was a terrifying barking sound. "Oh, you poor stupid boy," Silas said, wiping a tear from his eye. "You think we didn't account for that the inheritance is held in a trust in the Cayman Islands. It is not marital property. You get nothing. However," Silas reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo. He pulled out a thick, stapled document and tossed it onto the table in front of Mark. It landed with a heavy thud. I do believe in fair exchange, Silas said. You gave my niece 5 years of hell. I intend to return the favor. Mark looked down at the document. What is this? Read the header, Silas commanded. Mark's eyes scanned the page. Chimera Tech, shareholder acquisition, majority stake transfer. He looked up, his face gray. You bought the company? At 9:00 a.m. this morning. Silas nodded. I bought the controlling interest. I paid 20% over market value just to ensure the board wouldn't ask questions. They signed the papers an hour ago. Silas turned to the board of directors table. Isn't that right, gentlemen? The chairman of the board, a man Mark had spent years sucking up to, nodded vigorously, raising his glass to Silas. Welcome aboard, Mr. Blackwood. Mark felt the floor tilting. You own Chimera Tech. I own the company, Silas said, stepping closer, looming over Mark. Which means I own the building. I own the servers. I own the intellectual property. And most importantly, Silas plucked the champagne flute from Mark's trembling hand and handed it to a waiter. I own your employment contract. Silas turned to the crowd. As the new majority owner, I am making my first executive decision. Mark Sterling is hereby terminated for gross misconduct, public indecency, and general incompetence. You can't do that, Mark shrieked, lurching forward. I have a contract. I have rights. I'm the VP. You are trespassing, Silas said coldly. He snapped his fingers. 2 of the massive bodyguards stepped forward. They didn't ask Mark to leave. One grabbed Mark by the back of his collar and the other grabbed his belt. They hoisted him onto his toes. No, get off me! Mark kicked and flailed. Elena, tell them to stop. I'm your husband. I love you. The speech. It was a joke. I was just trying to be funny. Elena watched him struggle. Her face was unreadable. She walked over to where Jessica Thorne sat frozen. Elena leaned down, resting her hands on the table. Jessica flinched. He's all yours, Jessica, Elena said, her voice smooth as silk. I hope you enjoy him, but you should know, the company credit card he uses to pay for your dinners. It's been canceled, and the lease on the Porsche. That's a corporate lease, my corporate lease. Jessica's eyes went wide. She looked at Mark, who was being dragged toward the exit, screaming about lawsuits. Is that true? Jessica whispered. He's bankrupt, Elena said with a shrug. He's been leveraging his salary to pay off gambling debts on crypto. It's all in the audit my uncle ran this morning. If you stay with him, you're inheriting about $2 million in debt. Jessica stood up so fast her chair fell over. I didn't know. We were just colleagues. She grabbed her purse and ran toward the side exit, not even looking at Mark as he was hauled away. Elena! Mark's voice echoed from the doorway, desperate and broken. Baby, please, I can change. Give me another chance. Elena turned to her uncle. She didn't look at the doors. Uncle, she said softly. I'm tired. Can we go? Silas smiled, offering her his arm. The jet is waiting at the private airfield. I have a villa in Amalfi that has been waiting for an artist to fill it. They began to walk out. As they passed the stunned guests, Gary Reynolds, the man who had mocked Elena earlier, stood up holding his glass out. Elena? Gary stammered, a desperate, sycophantic smile on his face. I just want to say, I always knew you were special. If there's anything you need... Elena stopped. She looked at Gary. She didn't say a word. She just laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh, but a light, airy sound of pure freedom. She kept walking, leaving him standing there with his cheap wine and his fake smile. The doors swung shut behind them, leaving the elite of Seattle in a room that suddenly felt very small and very empty. The ballroom doors of the Grand Oak Hotel swung shut behind Mark Sterling, but the silence that followed was louder than the applause he used to crave. He stood in the lobby, dazed. The transition from being the man of the hour to a pariah had happened in less than 10 minutes. He looked around for Jessica Thorne. She was standing near the valet stand, furiously typing on her phone. "Jess," Mark said, his voice hoarse. He reached out to touch her arm. "Jess, wait. We need to strategize. Blackwood is bluffing. He can't just fire me like that without a tribunal. I have rights." Jessica recoiled as if he were contagious. She looked up from her screen, her eyes cold and hard. The flirtatious warmth she had shown him an hour ago was completely gone. "Don't touch me, Mark," she hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You just insulted the niece of Silas Blackwood on a live microphone. Do you know who owns the bank that holds my mortgage, the Blackwood Consortium?" "I didn't know," Mark pleaded, his hands shaking. "She was just Elena. She was nobody. Look, I can fix this. I just need to get to the office in the morning and pull the files on the—" "You're not going to the office," Jessica cut him off. "And neither am I if I'm seen with you. Lose my number, Mark. Seriously. If you call me, I'll file a harassment suit." She stepped into her waiting Uber and slammed the door. Mark watched the taillights fade into the rainy Seattle night. He turned to the valet. "My car, the Porsche. Bring it around." The valet, a young man named Kevin, who Mark had tipped poorly for 2 years, looked down at a clipboard. He didn't move. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," Kevin said, his face impassive. "We received a call from the leasing agency attached to Chimera Tech corporate accounts. A tow truck just left with the vehicle about 5 minutes ago. Repossession order." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. "Repossession? That's my car. I paid for the upgrades." "The lease is in the company name, sir," Kevin said finally, allowing a small, satisfied smirk to touch his lips. "And since you are no longer an authorized driver, well, you understand. Can I call you a taxi? It's raining quite hard." Mark Sterling, the man who had mocked his wife for wearing old shoes, had to walk 4 blocks in the pouring rain to find an ATM that would accept his personal debit card, only to find his account frozen due to suspicious activity investigation, triggered by the corporate audit Silas had ordered. He slept that night on a bench in the bus station, shivering in his $3,000 tuxedo. The Downfall, Day 3. The unraveling of Mark's life was not instant. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation. 3 days after the gala, Mark tried to enter the Chimera Tech headquarters. He wore his best suit, one of the few he had managed to salvage from the house before the locks were changed. He marched up to the front desk, ready to demand a meeting with HR. The lobby was bustling. Former colleagues, people who had laughed at his jokes and drank his wine, walked past him. They didn't just ignore him. They actively avoided eye contact, hugging the walls to keep their distance. He was radioactive. "I'm here to see the legal department," Mark told the receptionist, a woman named Sarah, whom he had once made cry by criticizing her headset. Sarah didn't look up. "Name?" "You know who I am, Sarah," Mark snapped. "Name?" she repeated, her voice monotonous. "Mark Sterling, Vice President." "Former Vice President," she corrected, typing slowly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling. Your clearance has been revoked. Security has been notified. You have a box of personal effects waiting at the loading dock." "The loading dock!" Mark's voice rose to a shout. "I am not a delivery driver. I built this department." 2 large security guards appeared behind him. One of them was the head of security, a man Mark had threatened to fire last month for taking a sick day. "Mr. Sterling," the guard said, his hand resting heavily on Mark's shoulder. "We can do this the easy way, or the way that ends with you in handcuffs for trespassing. Mr. Blackwood was very specific. He said if you caused a scene, we should let you exhaust yourself." Mark looked around. The entire lobby had stopped to watch. He saw Gary Reynolds, his sycophantic friend, standing near the elevator. "Gary," Mark yelled. "Gary, tell them about the quarterly projections." Gary looked at Mark, then looked at his phone, pretending to take a call. He stepped into the elevator and let the doors close. Defeated, Mark turned and walked out. He went to the loading dock. There, sitting in the rain, was a small cardboard box. Inside was a stapler, a half-empty bottle of cologne, and a framed photo of him and Elena. The glass on the photo frame was cracked. Getum. The Revelation, Day 10. Elena sat in the private lounge of a Gulfstream jet watching the clouds roll by beneath the wing. The cabin was quiet, smelling of leather and fresh orchids. Silas sat across from her reading a newspaper. He lowered it, looking at her with concern. "You haven't touched your tea," he said gently. "I'm just thinking," Elena said, turning from the window, "about how much time I wasted. 5 years, Uncle. I scrubbed his floors. I ironed his shirts. I let him tell me I was stupid." "You weren't wasting time, little wolf," Silas said, pouring her a fresh cup. "You were gathering intelligence. You were learning the difference between value and price. Your father wanted you to know what it felt like to be powerless, so that when you had power, you would never abuse it." He slid a heavy black folder across the table. "What is this?" Elena asked. "The audit of Mark's finances," Silas said. "And the settlement offer his public defender is begging us to accept." Elena opened the folder. She scanned the numbers. It was pathetic. Mark had been living on a mountain of debt, leveraging credit cards to pay off other credit cards, all to maintain the illusion of wealth. He was technically negative $2 million in the hole. "He wants to settle for no alimony if we drop the fraud charges," Silas explained. "He's terrified of prison. He's currently staying at the Motel 6 off the interstate. He sold his Rolex yesterday for $4,000. He thinks that will last him a few months." Elena traced the name Mark Sterling on the paper. She remembered the way he had looked at her on their wedding day, not with love, but with possession, like he had acquired a new appliance. "Don't drop the charges," Elena said softly. Silas raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you want him in jail?" "No." Elena shook her head. "Prison gives him a roof and 3 meals a day. It gives him a routine. I don't want him to have that security." She closed the folder. "Drop the fraud charges," she corrected herself, her eyes hardening. "But ensure the IRS audits him for the next 10 years. And make sure every hiring manager in the Fortune 500 knows that hiring Mark Sterling is a direct declaration of war against the Blackwood Consortium." Silas smiled a slow, terrifying expression. "So you want him to be free, but unemployable." "He told me I wouldn't survive a day in the real world without him," Elena said, taking a sip of her tea. "I want to see how he survives the real world without me." The final meeting, day 14. Mark sat in the small conference room of the law firm. He looked 10 years older. He hadn't shaved in days and his suit was wrinkled. He kept tapping his foot nervously. The door opened. Mark stood up, straightening his tie, instinctively trying to summon his old arrogance. But it wasn't Elena who walked in. It was a lawyer, a woman with sharp glasses and a sharper suit, and behind her, Silas Blackwood. "Where is she?" Mark asked, his voice cracking. "I need to talk to my wife." "Ex-wife," Silas corrected, sitting down at the head of the table. "And she has no interest in speaking to you. She's currently in Tuscany inspecting a vineyard she just purchased. She finds the air there cleaner." Mark slumped back into his chair. "This isn't fair. I made a mistake. One bad speech, one bad night. You can't destroy a man's life over a joke." "It wasn't a joke, Mark," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. "It was a confession. You showed the world exactly who you are. We're just helping the world react accordingly." The lawyer pushed a stack of papers toward Mark. "The divorce decree," the lawyer said. "Sign here, here, and here. By signing, you acknowledge that you have no claim to any Blackwood assets. You also acknowledge that the loan provided by Chimera Tech for your home is in default, and you agree to vacate the premises immediately." "Oh, wait. You've already been evicted. My apologies." Mark stared at the papers. "What about my severance? I was a VP. I have a contract." Your contract had a morality clause. Silas noted, checking his watch. Publicly humiliating your spouse and damaging the company's reputation voids your severance. You get nothing, Mark. Actually, that's not true. You get to keep your debts. Mark gripped the pen. His hand was shaking so violently he could barely hold it. I loved her. Mark whispered, a tear leaking out of his eye. It was a tear of self-pity, not regret. In my own way, I took care of her. You kept her as a pet, Silas said, standing up. And now the cage is open. Mark signed. The scratching of the pen sounded like a scream in the quiet room. As Silas turned to leave, Mark looked up. Mr. Blackwood, Mark called out. What? What is she worth? Really? Silas paused at the door. He didn't turn around. Elena's personal trust fund inherited from her father matures this year, Silas said, staring at the doorframe. It is valued at approximately $400 million. The Blackwood estate she will one day inherit is in the billions. Mark gasped. The air left his lungs. He had been married to $400 million, and he had treated her like a servant because she wouldn't buy a $50 tie. But, Silas added, finally turning to look at the broken man one last time, her dignity, that is priceless, and you couldn't afford it. Epilogue: The Painter of Amalfi. 6 months later. The Amalfi coast was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The sea sparkled like crushed diamonds stretching out to meet the endless blue sky. On the terrace of a villa that sat perched on the cliffs, Elena stood before a large canvas. She was wearing a linen dress, paint smudged on her cheek, her hair loose and blowing in the salty breeze. She looked nothing like the woman in the gray leggings who had cleaned Mark's floor. She looked vibrant, alive. She was painting a storm. Dark, swirling clouds of charcoal and navy, chaotic and angry. But in the center of the storm, breaking through the darkness, was a single piercing beam of gold light. It's beautiful, a voice said. Elena turned. A man was standing there. He was tall, with kind eyes and a smile that didn't feel calculated. His name was Julian, a curator from the gallery in Florence that had just offered to host her first solo exhibition. He didn't know she was a Blackwood. He only knew she was Elena the artist. It feels violent, Julian said, stepping closer to the painting. But hopeful. It's a memory, Elena said, wiping her hands on a rag, of a storm I survived. Did the storm pass? Julian asked, looking at her. No. Elena smiled, looking out at the ocean. I just learned how to be the lightning instead of the thunder. The butler arrived with a silver tray. On it was a single letter forwarded from the United States. The handwriting was messy, desperate. It was from Mark. Julian looked at the letter. Bad news. Elena picked up the envelope. She didn't open it. She didn't need to read his begging. She didn't need to read about his new job as a shift manager at a warehouse or his lonely nights in a studio apartment. She knew the story. She had written the ending. She walked over to the stone railing of the terrace. Below, the waves crashed against the rocks. Just junk mail, Elena said. She held the letter over the edge and let go. The wind caught it immediately. It swirled in the air, dancing for a moment before plummeting down, down, down into the churning white foam of the sea. It was gone in an instant. Elena took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of lemons and sea salt. She turned back to Julian and her painting. Now, Elena said, picking up her brush. Shall we discuss the gallery opening? I have an idea for the centerpiece. She dipped her brush into the gold paint. The past was at the bottom of the ocean. The future was bright, and for the first time in her life the canvas belonged entirely to her. And that is the story of how Mark Sterling learned the most expensive lesson of his life. Never mistake silence for weakness, and never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book owns the library. Elena proved that true worth isn't about the clothes you wear or the car you drive, but the dignity you carry within you. What did you think of Mark's punishment? Did he deserve to lose everything? Or was it too harsh? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice and karma, please hit the like button. Share this video with your friends and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.